So now we're going to talk about using the shutter, which is the other variable in your camera, the one that, like the aperture, controls the amount of light that hits your sensor. But the shutter is about time, where the aperture was about focus. And so if you're going to be using the auto settings, you'll be typically using what's called shutter priority. Shutter priority is really simple. You set the shutter speed, and the camera will change the aperture to let in the proper exposure. On pretty much all your cameras, it is usually some kind of setting on the control dial that will have an S for shutter, or T or TV for time variable. But shutter and time basically control the same thing, which is the amount of time that the shutter is open to let the light hit the sensor. And that is another tool that you can use to creatively make your photographs have different narratives. Let me do the basics of shutter speeds. A slow shutter speed, which is typically a 1/30th of a second to 1 second or even longer, can be used creatively, and it produces a certain kind of an image which can have a painterly effect. One of the problems with using the slow shutter speed, of course, is you risk getting motion from the camera shaking. So a lot of times if you're using slower shutter speeds, you may want to brace on a table, you may want to use a tripod or something like that. The speed at which the motion occurs in conjunction with the chosen shutter speed determines just how much of an effect will be translated to the sensor, which simply means experiment, experiment, experiment. I could tell you use this shutter speed for this kind of picture, but that may not be true. For example, what I do is 9 times out of 10, I'm going to set my shutter speed around a 15th of a second or an 1/8 of a second and start doing some experiments. Take some pictures and see if I like the motion, if I like how that slow shutter speed is creating a sense of time within my image. And I may go to a higher shutter speed or I may go to a slower shutter speed, but I do most of my tests or experimentation simply by setting a shutter speed, taking a picture, looking at the back of the camera, which is one of the great things about all digital cameras. Mirrorless at DSLRs, doesn't matter, but you take a picture, you look at the back of the camera and you say, yep, that's the effect I want, or no, it didn't quite work, let me try something different. A fast shutter speed or a high shutter speed is when the shutter is open for a very short period of time. A slow shutter speed, again, the shutter is open for a long period of time, it stays open, gets a lot of light on the sensor, but it's a longer period of time. A high shutter speed, by comparison, is a very, very short period of time. Typically, a 250th of a second up to, depending on what camera you're using, an 8,000th of a second, which is a pretty short period of time. If the desired outcome is to freeze the action, a high shutter speed is better. For instance, the motion of a speedboat flying across the water, football player jumping for a catch, or anything like that, motion of a dog or somebody throwing a frisbee, any of those things are typically going to be photographed with a higher shutter speed so you can stop the gesture or stop the moment. So on your screen right now, you'll notice I've got lists of some typical shutter speeds, what people will often refer to as a slow shutter speed or a fast shutter speed. And so a 1/30th of a second, a 15th of a second, all the way down to 1 second or slower is when you are going to show a lot of motion. The movement in your image will be very apparent. That's when you're typically, though, going to risk having camera shake, so you're going to want to rest the camera, as I said, on a table, on a tripod, or something to hold it still. By comparison, the higher shutter speeds are 2/50th of a second, all the way up to 1/8,000th of a second. One of the rules that I use, and this is a really simple way of understanding how slow can you go, what's the lowest shutter speed that a person can normally hand hold? And what I use is 1 over the focal length of the lens. That's what I use. So for example, if I'm using a 50mm focal length on my lens, typically the slowest shutter speed I can use is 1 over 50. If I'm using a 200mm lens, which is a longer lens, which will enlarge things, but also because it sees a narrower perspective, you need to use a higher shutter speed. So if I'm using a 200mm lens, the slowest shutter speed I can normally handhold is 1 over 200. And remember, I'm a professional, I'm supposed to know what I'm doing. So I would always use that rule of 1 over the focal length is the slowest shutter speed anybody can handhold. This is largely true, again, with the DSLRs and the mirrorless. And so that rule, 1 over the focal length, is a good starting point for determining what's the slowest shutter speed you can handhold without a tripod. If you want the motion to show, if you want to use a tripod, it's a completely different thing. But if I want to handhold the camera, I'm always going to use that rule. So here's some more basics of the shutter speeds. When you're using the slower shutter speeds, again, 1/30th of a second all the way down to 1 second or longer, if you want the action to have sort of a more poetic feeling, to show the grace and the fluidity, slow the shutter speed down and let the subject move through and kind of paint the sensor with motion. Again, this is that point where you want to decide 1 over the focal length is the rule that I use for whether I can handhold that or if I'm going to have to use a tripod. Most people think to themselves, The shutter speed of 1/30th or lower is when you would need to use a tripod or a bracelet or something. But again, for me, that 1 over the focal length is a more accurate rule. On the other hand, with a fast shutter speed, you can completely freeze the action. And if you want the action to stop and you arrest the moment, then use the fast shutter speed. Shutter speeds are to some degree just like apertures, in the sense that they control the amount of light that hits the sensor, and they control the way the viewer experiences the photograph. The aperture controls how much is in focus in the given picture, many things in focus or few things in focus. That's what the aperture controls. By comparison, what the shutter controls, of course, is the length of time the shutter is open, but how the viewer of your image experiences time. Is the action stopped, or is the action moving through as a blur? Again, one is not better than the other, but the trick is to go out and practice these and understand when are you going to use a high shutter speed to stop the action, or when are you going to use a low shutter speed to show the motion. So for example, to reiterate, if you're going to be using the shutter priority, where you pick a fast shutter speed to freeze the motion, you might use something as high as a 4,000th of a second, which is what you're seeing here in this picture by Frank Seitman. On the left is a photograph of mine, which was made with a mirrorless camera, as compared to Frank's, which was made with a DSLR. And you'll notice, though it's not quite as dramatic an image in terms of the spray of the water, I'm actually stopping the motion of the dog's foot just before it touches on the ground. And so that's the time variable, or the way that I'm telling the story, by using a higher shutter speed. Here's another photograph of mine made in New York City. My friend Jen is jumping for the camera, and so you see she's all the way up in the air, which tells you that I'm using a high shutter speed to stop the action. Another photograph of mine, also made with a mirrorless camera. Again, I'm using a high shutter speed to stop, so just that one car is caught. There's no blurring of the car, there's no motion showing in this particular image. Again, when you're using shutter priority, when you're making a choice about what shutter speed to use, there's not one that's right and there's one that's wrong. It's not that simple. Here you've got two pictures, for example, of a waterfall. The one on the left, with a higher shutter speed, the water is stopped. The one on the right, with a longer shutter speed, the water is blurring. It depends on the narrative that you want your image to have, but to my taste, of these two photos by Russ Burden, the one on the right is more interesting with a slower shutter speed because the water looks more poetic. It's flowing more smoothly. So for me, in a situation like this, I'm more likely to use a slower shutter speed. Another way of using the shutter to control the narrative of your image is to move your camera with the subject, which is typically called panning, because you'll pan or move your camera left to right to left, it doesn't matter, but you'll move your camera with the subject. And you'll typically be at such a slow shutter speed, there'll be some motion in the background, and if you follow the subject correctly, whatever you're panning with will stay sharp. So let me show you some pictures that illustrate this. Here's a picture of Frank's moving with an old car, and you'll notice that the car in the middle, and especially the windshield, are perfectly sharp because he moved his camera with them. But he was using a slow enough shutter speed that the background, by comparison, has those blurring lines, in this case from right to left. And this is a really good example of a nice background for panning, because those lines of the buildings or whatever was in the background are blurring nicely left to right. And so it sort of echoes the motion of the car. Another one of Frank's panning photos, in this case moving from left to right. You'll notice the razor board that she's riding on is pretty sharp because Frank did a very good job of moving his camera with it. Her dress is a little bit blurry, but it adds really nicely to the feeling of how active and energetic the image is. So sometimes you want to use a high shutter speed to stop action, but a lot of times I'm going to want to use a slow shutter speed to get more of a feeling or a mood. Another picture of Frank's, also made with a DSLR, and he's riding in the ride at the carnival, and so you feel like you're right there. And by using a slow shutter speed and moving with the subject, the lights in the background are actually blurry, which adds to the experience. It makes me feel even more like I'm right there. I'm the next person on this ride. An image of mine from Vietnam, in this case made with a mirrorless camera, panning with a motorcycle rider from right to left. And I actually wanted to pan on purpose because the background was pretty distracting and I didn't want all the junk and clutter in the background to ruin my image. So I actually panned with the guy as he went from right to left. Another image of mine from New York City, and Madison Square Park in the background, which could have been really, really busy and really could have sort of cluttered up my image, becomes those nice lines of the blurry trees as I move with the camera, in this case from left to right. Another one of Frank's pictures from Boston, and rowers, I'm guessing, on the Charles River, but I could be wrong. and he's moved with them. So it's not quite so perfectly sharp, but you get a really lovely sense of the motion that he used on purpose, that he chose to have a very slow shutter speed in order to get the feeling of what it's like to be watching the boat as it goes by. So when you're using the shutter to control the narrative in your images, there's essentially three approaches. A high shutter speed to stop the action. We just went through panning, where you move your camera with the subject matter to get the primary thing in focus and the background blurred. And then there's what's called blurring or motion blur. And in this case, if this blur is your desire, you want to set your shutter speed to a 30th of a second or 15th of a second, or even longer, to see if the lines, in this case of the waterfall that Frank photographed, to see if those lines are in fact blurred the way you want. So here's a close-up version of the same image, and you'll notice the lines of the water and the shutter speed it was used are slow enough that the water is actually not tack sharp, but those beautiful curves of the line coming over the waterfall look really nice. An image of mine, this is made in New Delhi in India, happens to be with a mirrorless camera, and I'm actually resting my camera on a sign, a traffic sign in the middle of New Delhi, and I'm resting my camera on it so the building in the background, which is a Sikh temple, is nice and sharp, and all the cars blurring by are energetic and frenetic, which is the kind of the narrative that I was trying to create with the image. Another one of mine, this is from Bangladesh in the fish market. I'm photographing from overhead, and my camera is actually resting on the balcony of the fish market, so the fish, which are for sale, are sharp, but all the customers are blurring around it. And so that was a narrative I'm trying to create, which is to make one thing fixed and one thing's active. And this is a real typical example of blurring or motion blur. Also in New York City, where the pedestrians are sharp and the trees and the crosswalk and all of that are sharp, but the taxis, which are going by rather rapidly, are blurred. And so again, that's a good example of motion blur. I'm actually resting on a mailbox to get my camera nice and steady, so I have everything sharp that I want except for the moving vehicles. A couple more pictures, one of mine on the left showing traffic in Providence, Rhode Island, and then Frank's on the right. And both of them, though they're different subject matters, use the same photographic technique. In both cases, we're using a slow shutter speed. We have the camera fixed on something. Mine's on a tripod, and I'm pretty sure Frank's is on a tripod as well. In his case, the water is coming down, and because he's using a longer shutter speed, the blurring of the lines of the water looks really, really nice. And in my case, the image on the left, the taillights of the cars going away from me on the freeway are blurred by the longer shutter speed that I'm using. And again, in both cases, the camera's holding steady, so the background on mine and the rocks on Frank's are both really, really sharp. Another image of mine from North India in a park at twilight. Camera's actually resting on the ground, and then people are walking by, so my trees are sharp and the atmosphere around is clear and that pink color in the sky is nice, but the actual people walking through the park are sort of made ghost-like, which was the kind of narrative I was trying to create. And for your enjoyment and inspiration, we're going to show you the images that I went through again. Don't be afraid to actually pause the class and look and say to yourself, okay, so the photographer did this, I want to go try to replicate that. So now let's talk about how you would actually use your camera to make what are often called motion blur images. And the typical motion blur image is a waterfall, where the landscape is fixed and the water is moving. And so I'm in beautiful Beacon, New York. Got a waterfall behind me, which is where I'm going to do the practice session and show you my different techniques. It's really pretty noisy over there, so I'm going to do most of my explanation here, right here in beautiful Beacon, New York, 5 minutes away from Digital Photo Academy's world headquarters. But because it's so noisy, I'm going to do the lesson here, and I'm going to walk over there and do the actual shoot, and then I'll come back. The key to motion blur, you probably know this already, but just a reminder, you have to have your camera somehow stable. I'm typically going to be using a tripod. I use Manfrotto tripods, some of the best tripods in the world. And I occasionally will not have a tripod with me, and I'll rest my camera on a table, press it up against a wall. But for this particular exercise, I'm actually going to use the tripod. And so it's going to involve things like composing the picture, as we talked about before, verticals and horizontals. And the key is I'm going to want to use as long a shutter speed as possible, which usually will mean the lowest ISO, a very small lens opening, and a long shutter speed, 1/4 of a second, 1/8 of a second, 1/2 a second or slower, in order to get the blurring of the lines of that water. And so that's how I'm going to create that magical motion blur effect. So when I'm doing motion blur, photographing things like waterfalls or any kind of activity where I want the camera fixed and the activity to move by, I'm going to oftentimes run into a problem that I can't get a low enough exposure. There's actually too much light. And so a lot of times I'm going to be pulling out of my back pocket my bag of Tiffin filters. And I carry a bunch of different Tiffin filters with me because each one does a slightly different job. The 3 Tiffin filters that I use the most are, I have what's called a clear ND, which actually, if you look at it, top half of this filter is darker than the bottom half of the filter. This is really, really useful when you're doing landscape photographs, because a lot of time in landscape photographs, the scene has a brighter part above the horizon and a darker part below the horizon. And this half ND with a darker part above the horizon will reduce the amount of light there, and it tends to equalize the exposure. Another filter I carry with me all the time is called a circular polarizer, because this is probably the most common filter people wonder about. As I turn it and you pay attention to the water, it will change the water, because what it's technically doing is it's cutting the reflection. So at one point in time when I'm turning, you'll see the reflection of the blue sky in the water. And then as I keep turning, that reflection will slowly go away, and then it will come back. And the idea behind a polarizer is not just in terms of photographing waterfalls. It's anywhere where you have reflections that you want to get rid of, such as, again, a hazy sky or something where there's a lot of light bouncing around, ruining your pictures. And so having a polarizer and then just rotating it, literally waiting until it looks correct to your eye, is how I find I use the polarizers most successfully. And then the one that I use a lot, especially for photos like I'm about to do, is what's called a variable neutral density. And what the Tiffin variable neutral density does is, as you rotate it, it is solid gray. It doesn't have any color influence or anything else, but it just reduces the amount of light that hits the sensor. And so in this case, because I'm photographing on a bright day and I want a very long exposure, I'm mostly going to use the neutral density filter to get a really, really long exposure. So I get that blurring effect with the lines. I probably will also experiment with the other two, because the half ND will give me the opportunity to make part of the image lighter and part of the image darker, depending on where I put that dark half. So I'm setting up my tripod. It's so bright out here that I'm going to actually have to look through the viewfinder. I personally prefer to use the folding screen when I can, but I can't in this situation just because it's too bright out here. So I'm going inside, organizing my composition. So right now what I'm doing is I'm slowly changing my variable neutral density, and it's taking away light. Oops, too much. That's a little too far. So I'm probably going to go about there, and that's made it a whole lot darker, and that's going to give me a whole lot longer shutter speed. Here's another tip or trick that I suggest. You want to go into the menus on your camera where the motor drive is, or the thing that gives you the option of shooting a single frame or a continuous frame. You'll also find what's called the self timer. And if you go further, 99% of your cameras have what's called a 2-second self-timer. The 10 or the 12-second self-timer is designed for you to set up the camera, hit the button, and then run around and get in the picture. But the 2-second self-timer is designed for this exact purpose. I don't have a cable release or a remote, and I want to push the button. During the 2-second, the self-timer that only runs 2 seconds is running. It actually, all the shake and all the camera vibration that I do by pushing it, that goes away. Then the camera releases the shutter, so the camera is really nice and stable to get the kind of picture the way I want. So I've made a few pictures now. My exposure actually is 3 seconds at f/22, which is a very long exposure. f/22 is a very small opening. I'm getting really nice lines for the water moving. And that variable neutral density, the Tiffin variable neutral density filter, ate up, if you will, all that light. And so I'm able to have a very, very long exposure, which works perfectly in this situation. Next thing I'm going to do is do somewhere I'm going to zoom in tighter. I'm going to do some verticals, some horizontals, the whole waterfall, different parts of the waterfall. One of the most common experiments I'm going to be doing is experimenting with different focal lengths and composition. So right about here, I get that water and the rocks at the bottom correctly, so I'm going to use this version here. And then I'm going to back to zoom up and do another version, keep doing another version. So my exposure is 3 seconds at f/22. That Tiffin variable neutral density filter ate up a lot of the exposure, giving me that very, very long shutter speed. I have my camera all set up. I like the composition with the vertical lines of the water falling and then the horizontal lines at the bottom where the water's hitting. I'm going to hit the shutter button, and it's going to take 2 seconds for the self-timer to kick in, 3 seconds for the exposure, and then look at that. And the nice thing you'll notice as I zoom in is that the rocks are very sharp and the water is beautiful, but because it's got that long exposure, it looks more like ribbon than it being absolutely tack sharp, and that's what I like about this kind of photograph. So now that you have a better handle on how to use shutter speed to create different kinds of narratives in your images, just like before, the trick is to now go out and take a lot of pictures. Set your shutter speed on a lower shutter speed if you're using shutter priority, below a 15th or below an 1/8. Try some panning, try resting the camera on something and taking pictures, and also try moving with the subject matter to pan. Don't worry about creating masterpieces. Just take some pictures and start to understand things like when are you going to want to rest the camera in one place to get the traffic blurring by and to leave the environment fixed, for example. Or when are you going to want to pan with the car to show that motion of the car. And so you really just want to take some pictures, practice, look at the examples in the back of the camera, practice some more, and after you've really kind of got a handle on mastering how to use the shutter correctly, you want to come back and watch the next lesson.